To another episode of the Mental Health Movement podcast, Voice for the Voiceless. I am your host, Chris. Today we have a very special guest. She majors in criminal justice, and today we're going to be talking about the mental health within our youth and also within the prison systems. Please help me welcome Reidyn. Reidyn, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast. It definitely means a lot.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, when this podcast does air, it's going to be Suicide Prevention Month, and I found it very important to talk about this subject. Because you brought the subject to me, and just with suicide numbers now bleeding into our youth and just everything else, it's heartbreaking, and I hate reading about it and I hate hearing about it. So definitely want to try and shine some light on that community just to get that word out, try and break that stigma and share the message the best that we can.
Yeah, I feel the same way about it. I know too many young people that, taken their lives way too soon, so
Yeah.
it's
um
heartbreaking.
on this podcast, just gonna kind of ask you a couple questions and we'll bounce off of each other, just trying to talk about it. The biggest thing that I'm actually really happy about is you just recently graduated high school like a couple years ago, what, like 3-4 years ago, right?
2020, yep, the great
um
old year.
oh yeah. um and me being out of school for well over 10 years now, I found it nice to be able to share the experience that both you have and the one that I had. Just I want to hear those mental health differences, so I'm really looking forward to asking you these questions. So I'm gonna start it off with your major. So starting with your major in criminal justice, what all were you taught on the mental health within the youth and children community?
So I just went through, like all the juvenile justice stuff, juvenile delinquents and things like that, and a lot of it really stems from, childhood experiences, and that, can affect them throughout their childhood and then carry on into adulthood as well. Many juveniles who turn to crime have experienced some type of trauma as a child, and not all of them, but there's quite a few children that come from low income households or have abusive parents and things like that that kind of lead them down the wrong path, and sometimes they don't always get the support that they need, which in turn they turn to crime to kind of act out in a way, or just a rebellious type of attitude.
Right. Before I ask the follow-up question I had to that, just kind of want to get your perspective on this because I come from a divorced family. My parents divorced over 20 years ago, and I guess the question I had for you is your perspective on a single parent household. Do you think that has a really big influence on kids acting out or just turning to crime just to, I don't know, either get that rush or just like kind of feel something within themselves that are struggling with that mental health kind of stuff?
Definitely. I mean, I my best friend comes from a single parent household, and um, just seeing how she's grown up compared to how I've grown up, just you can definitely tell the difference of having, two parents in the household versus one parent. And, it can really affect, especially at a young age, if the parents split up when the child's so young, they don't know what's going on, things like that, that can stick with them in the back of their mind, like what happened,
Right.
things like that.
Um, so from your personal experience, uh, what would you say was more difficult for you? Was it going into high school from middle school, or would you say just like the whole experience of high school? Because I know some people may have struggled a little bit more with middle school and high school was a breeze and vice versa. So I guess for a woman, how was that transition going into high school versus being in high school?
Transition. So it was kind of weird because my high school, Typically seventh and eighth grade is, middle school. Um, but seventh and eighth grade was actually in the high school for my school. So it was just the downstairs part and then the upstairs was high school. So we kind of were easily transitioned into the high school experience with that. So that kind of helped most of us kind of go from, middle school life to high school, just having that environment around us already. It was definitely seventh and eighth grade were definitely felt more like high school than middle school, but um, I mean, I can't really speak on seventh grade because I missed a lot of seventh grade due to being really sick. So, but I know eighth grade was a really good transition year, and I actually really enjoyed eighth grade. So,
Right.
going from that into high school was a little scary because I knew I was going to miss being, downstairs and then going upstairs, we're just like this whole new place. And I know there's a lot of high schools that are bigger than what mine was, and I can't imagine how it is just going to from a smaller type of place to this big open space with all these, older people, you got the upperclassmen, things like that. It can really be scary. I mean, I know I was always afraid of being late to class. That was the most like scary thing to me.
Right. Did you share buses with the high schoolers too, or how did that work?
Yep, seventh and eighth grade had to share with the 9 through 12. Um, they, started at the same time as the high school, everything like that. It's 7 through 12, and everyone just did the same thing. It was just, seventh and eighth grade technically would be considered middle school.
Right. My middle school, the one that I finished in, was connected to an elementary school, and my high school and middle, or yeah, my high school, we had the same buses as middle schoolers, but we didn't. They weren't connected like my middle school was with my elementary school. And I remember when I was in like eighth grade, or no, what was it? Sixth grade, that I was going to Seven Springs middle school, and we were riding with the high schoolers. And like you said, being with those older upperclassmen is intimidating.
Yeah, definitely.
And we were riding the buses with them. So, like those 16, 17-year-old kids just like pushing you around and stuff. And I always found it really difficult to uh, just be around that environment, just because so many of the upperclassmen were just so mean. And I remember going into ninth grade and didn't know what to expect because, like you said, you're in high school and you don't know what to expect from all these older kids that you're now around in different classes and stuff. And I just remember feeling so lost in ninth grade. Like, I feel like I didn't have an identity until like 10th grade. And I feel like a lot of kids, I obviously don't want to speak for you, but I feel like a lot of kids, when they're going into high school, struggle with finding their identity and who they are as a person.
Yeah, I mean, ninth grade, I didn't do anything like extracurricular kind of things like that. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I mean, seventh and eighth grade, you could technically join some of the things that the high schoolers did. But that was just the intimidation factor of like they're so much older, they're the high schoolers. But when you join ninth grade, it kind of feels a little bit easier, but you just don't know what you want to do at that point. So I never really joined anything until 10th grade because it was just kind of the transition year of getting used to being, up in the higher grades.
Right. And I feel like when you're in 10th grade, you're not getting targeted by seniors.
Right.
you know? Um, so I guess we kind of like covered that follow-up question of what your experience was going through high school. With your experience in school, how has that influenced you on how your son's going to be raised? Like, do you see things a little differently now that you have a child of your own, or do you know like there's a specific way your son's gonna be raised based on your upbringing or based on your experience within school?
Well, I know, school nowadays, it's so much different with all the technology. just my last couple of years of school, we were allowed to have our phones now, and then now they have iPads and computers and things like that. But just I believe it was tenth grade or 11th grade. I don't remember which one. They said, okay, you guys can have your phones. You just can't, obviously use them in class when the teacher says so. Um, and that's probably one of the biggest things that like not really worries me, but cyberbullying is such a big thing, and now with having phones in school, you never know what people are going to do. Sometimes it can be a good thing to have your phone in school because you never know what's going to happen to reach out to, help or anything like that. But there's also kids that will use that in a negative way. And, it's kind of just pros and cons of having the technology. And I know I want my son to be able to have a good experience in school, but and I don't, I definitely don't want him to be one of those kids that is causing, issues and things like that. I want him to know that he can do what he wants, like in a way. I want him to be able to do whatever extracurricular he wants to do, but not to like overdo it and cause burnout, anything like that. And I want him to know that he can talk to people about things. Like if something's happening in school, he can come to me. And that's like the biggest thing I want him to know is that he can come to me, come to his dad, either of us to tell us if something is going on, talk to us about it. We want to know, we want to help, that kind of thing. Because, with everything changing these days, high school is just completely different, even just from, the 3 years ago I was in it.
Yeah, and it's crazy that you bring up the technologies. I remember when they first started introducing computers into schools. Like we had the computer lab with the
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen them with their like really thick Apple computers. They were all different colors, and that was when Apple started like putting out iPods and stuff like that. Um, and I'm really happy that you brought up cyberbullying because I feel that's a subject that not many people include in the bullying conversation. Like when people think of bullying, you think of like 1970s where kids were throwing people in trash cans and stuffing them in lockers. It's just like we're in 2023 and cyberbullying and just like kids are sorry to say, kids are assholes,
Mm.
you know? and
Yeah.
and obviously that's a huge reflection on the parenting too, is I just feel like so many parents are so quick to just hand their kids an iPad and use it as a babysitter. And
Hmm.
the parent's not involved in that kid's life and doesn't know what that kid's doing on Facebook. I mean, there's 16, 17-year-old kids that have Facebook. So it's just like, dude, no way in hell. Like the day I have kids or if I have kids, they will not have social media like they're any of their early teens or adolescent years. Cause I just feel like you said, cyberbullying is serious. It has gotten really bad since MySpace. I mean,
Hmm.
MySpace was never this bad, but now at Facebook, where everybody can literally get all your information, Twitter, where it's so easy to pull information off of people too. It's a crazy world we live in, and I just hope that when it comes to the next generation of parenting, or I guess your generation of parenting, I hope that we can create that foundation of kids for their generation to, stick up for each other and like you said, be able to have these conversations. Cause I know when I was a kid, my anything I was going through was always used against me. And my mom was very narcissistic and my dad was very emotionally numb to like anything. And anything I would try to tell him, it was just kind of met with a rub dirt in it, man up kind of mentality. And it's his generation. I can't completely fault him for that.
Hmm.
But the most important part of what you mentioned is just being that person for your kid that, yeah, you're his mom, but at the same time, you can also be a friend to him when he needs it. And I feel like a lot more parents need to establish that balance between parent and friend, because it's like, oh well, so and so is best friends with their mom, but they're not much of a mom. It's just like you got to have that balance there. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I know I'm grateful that, to have my mom, like I consider her my best friend because I pretty much go to her for everything. Even with having a son, everything that happens with him, like first person I think to call is her. And, it could be middle of the night. There was one time where not long after he was born or whatever, he was kind of just like stiffening up, just kind of baby reflexes and things like that. And I didn't know what was going on. And it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I called her up and was like, I have no idea what's happening. And she's like, calm, reassuring me, it's normal. Eventually he stopped doing it, and she stayed on the phone with me until I was, calm and until I knew he was okay.
Yeah. It's always great to have that reassurance with any kind of support system. And
Mhm.
I'm happy to hear that you're willing to be that for your son, because most people will say it but don't really follow through with it. You know what I mean? And knowing your mom and knowing you quite a bit, I know that it's genuine and it's not just a I want to put a positive message out there but not follow through with it. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, so this actually kind of bleeds into the next question I had for you. Growing up in a generation of technology being at its absolute peak in probably every aspect, right? Do you
Mhm.
feel social media has added to the mental health struggles in society, or do you think it's benefited from so much exposure?
I mean, I feel like it's kind of been both. You got the whole issue with cyberbullying, and then you have these news outlets always broadcasting like these like tragic stories, traumatic events, things like that. These things happen, but it feels like these news outlets put overemphasis on these, and like they're talking about them for weeks after weeks, and it's just adding to the scare and the fear that they're trying. Like it feels like they're just putting fear into people rather than giving them news. But then you have, you know, resources like the mental health group and things like that, people can turn to. And then there's the other resources that, like the 988 number, the suicide hotline, you can use your phone, you can do the text for the crisis line. There's some benefits to it, but then, there's other things where, you can go into Twitter or whatever and you just see headline after headline of just terrible things happening in the world and just makes you afraid.
Yeah, yeah, no, I completely agree, and I'm definitely torn on the conversation of social media because I've made it known on like almost every single subject when it comes to mental health. It's just kind of I always make it a point to make people aware. It's like, listen, like this isn't just a hashtag to us. Like this isn't just a trendy subject. Like when I talk about suicide numbers and when I talk about kids that are taking their life, it's like I'm not sitting here using my platform for attention. I want awareness, and that awareness needs to be shared. Just like you said, the media. I don't understand why people can't treat mental health and stuff like they do with the news. It's like this is serious, and I feel we're in a very delicate point in society where these issues are rising and they're getting worse. And it kind of seems like a giant echo chamber is probably the best way to describe um, the mental health community. It's just like, we're all saying the same message. I'm telling you what you've told me, and it's just all going in one giant melting pot, and it's not going anywhere. It's not being fed to people that can't hear the message. And then you have the men's suicide numbers just going outrageous, and you have kids the age of 14 taking their life. It's heartbreaking to me because social media is such a powerful influence in our everyday life. And we can literally use it for everything. And nobody uses it for a positive beacon to break the stigma, to share awareness about these things. Like when I first started this podcast, and I remember telling my therapist, I said, there's so much information on the internet. You can type anything in Google, you can find it, right? there's so much information within this mental health community that is on a website, which is great. I'm happy there's resources, but how many people are reading those resources? How many people know those resources exist? When I was doing the crisis text line and I was giving resources to people, and like, I didn't even know that existed. Or when they did the 988 number, no, I'm like, oh, I didn't hear about that. It's just like, why is this not national news? You know what I mean?
Hmm. I feel like a lot of it gets pushed down by, just all these other random stories and things like that, I mean, sure, some of the stuff's important, but, this is also important. And it just keeps getting pushed to the bottom of the pile of what needs to be shared.
Yeah. One of the influencers that I had on this podcast a couple sessions ago was telling me that there's like a report on the like statistics on TikTok of like what gets shared where, and she said that like mental health falls in like 5% on people's like algorithm. So like
Hmm.
most of the content doesn't get seen, which is insane because again, it's such a serious subject and nobody for some whatever reason doesn't talk about it.
Right, yeah. I mean, I don't really go on TikTok that much anymore, but I know when I did at first, it's just all these like clips and funny videos and things like that, and you don't really have, you know, people talking about mental health and things like that, even though if you search it in the search bar, there's thousands of videos about it. It just doesn't come up on people's pages.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely heartbreaking because I feel like there's a lot of subjects in the mental health field that a lot of people are very uncomfortable talking about, suicide being one of them.
Hmm.
And when that subject comes up, it's always met with like clashing ideologies and stuff. And it's just, there's too much divide, I think, in the mental health community. And I think that's one of the reasons that we don't get as big of a spotlight as I think it should.
Hmm.
Um, So the next question I had for you, and this is kind of like your high school and college experience, just to kind of get a feeler on resources. But do you think there are enough resources within high school and college for those struggling with mental health, or do you think there should be more?
I mean, there can always be more. There's never enough. But I feel like even if there are resources, people aren't encouraged enough to utilize these resources. They feel like I mean, it's kind of like with social media and like all these other sites and things, you don't know they exist until someone says something about them. And then you're like, oh, that's a thing that I can use. They aren't being told about these resources as often as they should be. And I feel like a lot of the times, there's the counselors, the teachers, things like that. Sometimes I feel they just don't take it as serious as they need to be taking it. Sometimes they just brush it off like under the rug. There's other things that need to be done, things that need to be taught. They don't really consider the fact that, you know, a child might be going through something and they need to be there for them. They just kind of push them to the side, and that's one of the other things that, I feel like schools need to work on and do better with is that. I mean, they can have as many resources as they need. They just have to be serious about those resources.
Right. And it's always crazy to me when you see like news reports of kids like 14, 16 years old that take their life and the school happens to be on the news and some like students might be interviewed, some teachers might be interviewed. You would think that would be a wake-up call for all these schools, like all over the country. Not even it doesn't even just go to one, it's all these schools, and I can tell you from personal experience, reading that in my entire elementary, middle school, high school career, I can honestly tell you there's only one person that had an everlasting impact on my life, and I still talk to her every day, is my elementary school teacher. I don't know if you've heard this story on any of my podcasts before, but she was there when my parents got divorced. She was there to help me, to teach me how to tie my shoes. I was 8 years old, and she's been there for me every day since. I went to her mom's funeral. I just, her and I are that close.
Hmm.
And the second experience I had was in middle school, when I started like having problems with like school and just like dark thoughts and stuff. And I was, that transition from elementary school to middle school was very awkward and very uncomfortable. And I just remember going to the counselor's office like once a week, and she would help me a lot. Um, I don't remember her name because it wasn't everlasting. It was very brief. But my mom and dad had no idea about it. I didn't tell them. And then we moved. I moved with my mom, went to another school, didn't try counseling again. Um, and the third experience I had in school was ninth grade. Uh, was my first unalive attempt. And 14 years old, just kind of struggling with like depression and all that stuff. I didn't really know how to process that stuff. And somebody had alerted a resource officer that I was going to do it. I had the means, I had a plan, I was getting ready to do it. And the resource officer got to me in time and tackled me to the ground. Um, and I got Baker acted. And basically, they took me to this place called the Harbor, which is like 15 minutes away from my house. And they paired me up with a counselor that was there for a gambling addiction. Now, this is over 10 or goddamn, I'm 31. This is over 10 years ago, right?
Hmm.
And looking back at it now, it's a complete joke to say how bad mental health resources were back then. And it still happens today. The free therapy is great to have, but like you said, there's not enough people in that bracket of free therapists that honestly don't really give a shit, to be honest, because they're not doing it for money. And like you mentioned, there are people in this community that unfortunately do it for just the money and not for taking care of people.
Hmm.
So I agree. I think there could always be more. I don't think there's enough resources. I just wish there was more funding for that to happen, because I think counselors are incredible human beings. I mean, I think it's like a level under therapists. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, definitely. There definitely not enough funding to, get those resources out there.
So let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about the prison system and how those incarcerated for short term or long term. What kind of resources does an inmate have access to?
So in the prisons, they, have, there's psychologists and things like that, but they don't always, it's kind of, let me just restart here. It's kind of a hit or miss kind of situation. You got the psychologists and stuff there, and they can go see, psychologists, things like that. But then you also, during the rest of the day have just correctional officers around, and a lot of times these guys aren't trained to notice any signs of, mental health and people that are struggling or people that are even suicidal. And they just don't know the signs and what to look for, So sometimes, they get there before or after it's already too late.
Right.
And, you know, there's not the resources inside the prison, there's not, enough for them to, once they're released, to, you know, re-enter society, successfully and, be, a proper citizen at that point, then they just kind of cycle back into their, you know, crime ways and
Yeah.
end up back in prison. And it's just kind of a never-ending cycle of not getting the help that they need.
Right. And obviously a felony is something very serious, right?
Hmm.
And it's something that people pay the price for, and they make that decision to commit that felony, right? I think the people that have done their time and try to go back into to society, I think should be given more of a chance to be a productive member of society than they are given. Because I feel any kind of felony is obviously awful, But if they do that time, they paid for their mistake, and people can change. We've historically seen people change, right?
Hmm.
I think that prisons should do a better job at trying to get these people jobs when they're on their way out of their sentence. And too many times you see, and like you mentioned, too many times you see these guys stay within that crime mentality, and their whole life is just going in and out of prison. Um, my mom had married a guy right after she divorced my dad, who was he was a convicted felon, and he was in and out of jail from the time that they got married all the way up until maybe like 2 years ago, and that's a span of over 10 years, right?
Hmm.
And he told me from personal experience he almost has a better life in prison than he does out here, because he can't get a job, he can't get a place to stay, because background checks and immediately see felony, and people are like, oh no, we can't have felons here. And I think it's kind of like where society was with, and I know this might be a weird comparison, but I'm just using this as a small example, but like kind of like how society was for a while with tattoos, right? Remember when EMTs, they wouldn't let them, show their tattoos at all, and just like any kind of different look other than a professional look, or not professional, but like you couldn't show any piece of yourself within your body of work. It always had to be long sleeves, don't show any tattoos, don't show any piercings and all that stuff, right?
Hmm.
And now we're in a society where you can go to Starbucks and see somebody with purple hair and 20 piercings and tattoos all over, and nobody bats an eye. I kind of wish it was like that for, obviously not all felony charges, because there are some a lot worse than others. I definitely think there should be like some bar there on the extremity of if it's a very serious felony, then okay, I can understand you don't want this person working at Toys R Us, right? um
Right.
but like if it's like a small felony of, he did 2 years, he has a felony on his record, he learned his lesson, went through counseling and all the court directed stuff, I think guys and girls like that should be given another chance to prove that they've changed in those 2 years, or they changed in those 5 years, instead of society just saying, oh, well, F you, you have a felony on your record, we want nothing to do with you, right?
Right. And a lot of that, I mean, I just recently learned is what is called like invisible punishments, where once they're released from prison, you know, they are still being punished for the crimes that they've done, even though they've already served their time, they've already, went through their punishment, and just being released, they're still going through it, where they, some of the rights that they used to have, they don't have anymore. And, they can't, get a job, get housing, get, welfare, anything. Like, once you have that felony on your record, even if, it was a small, minor little thing, you're just kind of stuck.
And so my question is, when they're out of prison, do they have like any kind of like mental health resources that are given to them to go to, or is it just kind of like a fend for yourself the second the gate opens kind of thing? Because I feel like, me personally, I would like to see a therapist or somebody be like assigned to these specific people. And obviously we know the mental health community, it's the shortage of people in this community, and I totally understand that, but I feel like a lot of these people that are coming out of prison still have that shit. I was in prison for 5 years and now I'm going into society, I don't know how to be a functioning member of society again. I think it would be nice to see a mental health resource of some sort being assigned to them, and make it like forced for like a month or something, and then after that you figure it out kind of thing. um But going back to my question, is there anything like that for them?
I feel like a lot of it, people are looking for that to occur either in prison or like rehabilitation type
Mm.
facilities. There's a lot of times people that are released from prison end up on parole. for a little while just to finish out their sentence. I mean, there's some cases where they serve the whole sentence in prison and then they're released, but a lot of times they end up on parole after serving a certain portion of their sentence if they're, you know, served a good amount, and then they can go on parole. And then while on parole, the officers are supposed to provide those resources for these people. Not all the time they do, but that's just how, going back to these people aren't actually caring.
Right.
Um, but for them to be released back into society just straight from prison, I feel like they don't get that help that they need. And if they didn't get the help while in prison, that's when that never ending cycle comes back where they're out there. They don't, you know how to return to society, and then they end up right back in prison.
And it's crazy to me because how massive the incarceration rate is, right? I feel you would think they have more mental health resources for those prisons. Obviously, one therapist for 10,000 prison members. I don't know how many people a prison holds, but just 10,000 for one therapist. I mean, obviously that's unrealistic to help everybody, right? But
Hmm.
I feel like there should be like a whole psych wing for to help people. I kind of feel the same way about mental health resources in the prison system that I do with the VA. I feel like more people suffer than they need to, and it's just kind of like a shrug your shoulders. Oh well, you've been locked up, or oh well, you served the country, and we're going to give you the bare minimum of resources, and that's it. And I kind of feel that's how prison inmates are treated. And again, everybody makes mistakes, and there's certain levels of what you can and can't forgive, right?
Right.
And it's frustrating just thinking about it, because I know so many people who have been locked up that are actually decent human beings that just kind of got caught in a bad way, that just kind of come out of jail, and it's just like they don't know what to do with themselves and just go back to what they know, and that's fucking up and going to prison again. And
Hmm.
sorry for my language, but um yeah, I just it's heartbreaking to hear there's not enough.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, these people that, are committing these crimes and stuff like that, there's some people, that do it for other reasons, but then there's some reasons like, they are just struggling to live, and then they turn to crime because they, can't put food on the table for their kids or anything like that. And they end up in prison, and then they don't get any help and any resources. They're just kind of behind bars, and then they come back out, and it's kind of the same situation that they're in. They still can't get a job, still can't do this. They're just kind of in a cycle of not being provided with help that they need to live.
Right. Um, so you mentioned to me that you had a project you did on the mental health in prison. So can you tell us and the listeners what all did that entail?
So pretty much we had to create like a position statement paper about the issue of prisons being used as mental health institutions now that there's very little like actual facilities specifically for mental health. A lot of people struggling with mental health end up in prison because there's nowhere else for them to turn to, and their behaviors and the way that they act, sometimes can lead to more illegal acts rather than, and so half the time they can't help it. They're not getting the help that they need, and then that's when they end up behind bars. Um, there's just this paper pretty much I had to explain, the lack of services, why people with mental health issues are ending up in prison, and how one of the big things I know is how police respond to the mental health calls. They're always, and I understand for safety and things like that, but they don't have the training to handle these calls. And I think that that's the big thing, that they should have the training to respond to these calls for the safety of everybody.
Yeah, and people like my friend Tiffany, who does like the crisis training with police officers and stuff. Um, I wish there was more people as dedicated as she is to get that message out to police forces, because I you're starting to see it to a point where you have an entire police force resigning in other states because of just how bad things are in this world and this
Mm.
country. And I think I'm on the fence with letting non-police officers go to like mental health crisis stuff, because you don't know what's going to happen. You know what I
Right.
mean? And like you said, for safety reasons, but at the same time, that officer may or may not be trained with the mental health, like de-escalation. It's just, we're gonna throw cuffs on you because you're a little crazy and whatever. Um, I don't agree with sending a social worker out or anything of that nature. And the only reason I say that is again, you don't know what this person is capable of. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like a domestic violence issue, for example. Sure, you can send a counselor out there and I guess have them de-escalate it, but what happens if it's a violent domestic violence situation? You're not going to
Right.
send a counselor out there. You can't do that. I just feel like you're putting unarmed citizens or a regular citizen in danger just to try and help two other citizens. So I guess I'm just kind of on the fence with the proposal of having social workers or uh, therapists or anything of that nature go out to a distress call like that, because it's just always a very sticky situation, and I just feel like way too circumstantial on all those cases.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I feel like you need some kind of crisis team. And I know a lot of departments are trying to put together these like crisis response teams that, are trained on handling the situation, but also making sure that the situation is safe and no one's getting hurt, the officers or the parties involved, that everyone's staying safe and that can de-escalate the situation and try and get the situation handled, without violence or anything like that occurring.
Right. Um, so I know we kind of touched on it a little bit, the prisons versus the institutions. Do you know why institutions were just kind of like slowly done away with? Like I never really like looked into it to really know why they were just kind of silently done away with. Like, is it just because it was just people dumping medicine into people? Like I don't, I guess my brain can't really process.
So I touched up on this a little bit in that project as well, where deinstitutionalization is often kind of like the word thrown out there as the reason why, people with mental health issues are ended up in prisons. Um, there used to be so many facilities, and I mean, these facilities probably weren't always the greatest back then, but there used to be resources and facilities for people to turn to rather than ending up behind bars. And I feel like a lot of it has to do with funding. Um, you know, they had to turn funds towards other things, and that's really what hit these institutions and ended up, closing down a lot of these institutions is just the money aspect of everything.
Is an asylum the same exact thing as an institution? Like are those basically the same thing, just called different?
I mean, I wouldn't really, I mean, this is kind of just coming from my opinion.
Yeah.
I wouldn't really compare those two together as like the same thing just because I mean, they're both there to help people.
But
Um,
one's like more extreme than the other, right?
yeah, it's kind of like how, you have a prison that, you have like the maximum security and minimum security. One's, there for more violent people to kind of just keep society protected from the violence that they may cause. Whereas, in prisons, they're just, keeping them away, whereas asylums are supposed to help those people. rather than just keep them locked up.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, I don't think I've heard the word asylum my entire life. Like I same with institution. I think there's always just kind of been like a psych ward part of a
Hmm.
hospital, but I don't think I've ever seen like a institution, especially for mental health. Well, I guess the Harbor, I guess, is kind of an institution. So I guess yeah, i'll take that back. There is an institution around. But yeah, I guess just I feel like in like the movies, and obviously we're talking about movies, so movies always exaggerate everything. But I feel like whenever they've like shown asylums, you always just see like the worst of the worst kind of situations with mental
Right.
health stuff. So yeah, I guess that makes sense that they're two completely different entities. Where I feel like it, whereas an institution, I feel like you can kind of do like the outpatient stuff.
Yeah, and I feel like asylum as well is also like a lot of the old type of facilities and things like that. That's kind of the word that they used then, how things were run back then. They would send them to, mental asylums and things like that rather than, facilities or institutions for, psychiatric hospitals, mental hospitals, things like that. They kind of just threw the word asylum out there, and that is how, people were being treated, people with mental issues, they'd be sent to the asylum.
Right. Okay. Um, What do you think is the most common misconception in the mental health community?
Um, Probably the stereotypes is probably like the biggest thing in mental health is, you got so many people believing these myths and things like that about mental health, and people even in the community that, are kind of being silent and staying in the background because they believe in these myths that people are throwing around stereotypes that like mental health makes you weak or things like that. And all these different stereotypes that are being thrown around out there, just I feel like that's probably like the biggest thing in the community that, and a lot of people aren't wanting to come forward because people are using these stereotypes so often and, saying, you're weak if you have some type of mental disorder, you're violent, you can't recover from it, things like that, all these different stereotypes, and that's really what brings people, away from wanting to speak out.
And I feel like with those stereotypes comes with the people that like to just label themselves of having
Hmm.
mental illnesses that they were never diagnosed with. And
Right.
I've seen that in the group. I've seen that around me where I've known somebody my entire life. I'm like, oh yeah, I have depression. I'm like, okay, do you have depression, or are you saying you just have depression? Because
Hmm.
feeling sad is not depression. Like that's
Right.
not how that works. Um, and I feel, like you said, the stereotypes are so bad. They're so bad. Especially in like when it comes to like suicide stuff. Like I said earlier, there's that freaking divide all the time. Like for example, I told your mom this story, but I'll tell you too because it's just infuriating to me. This guy was sharing his story about his unalive attempt, and he jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. Like by the grace of God, he survived, right? And after I got done watching it, I was very emotional. I said, "Oh my God, thank you so much for sharing your story. Stand up for men's mental health." There's nothing wrong with that statement, right? I didn't downplay anybody else, and everybody who commented on there immediately spearheaded me. Oh, well, women's mental health matters too. And all mental health matters. It's like, listen, I didn't say it didn't.
Right.
Like, this is a man sharing his story. A man. Like, if there was a woman in there sharing her story too, I would have said, oh, great, mental health matters. I'm not, when I say men's mental health, like, I didn't add the word matters. I just said stand up for men's mental health. That's literally it. And I got attacked over 100 comments within an hour. Just saying like, oh my God, you didn't say women's mental health too, and all mental health matters. It's just like, man, this is why people do what they have done. This is why so many people are leaving, in the unfortunate event of unaliving themselves, because there's all this hatred and all this divide. It's just like, why can't you just leave it at a positive comment? Because that's what it was,
Hmm.
and I just when you stick a gender on there, it's always met with like anger. Like if I would have just said, you know, stand up for women's mental health or stand up for kids' mental health. It's just like, oh well, adults matter too. It's just like,
Hmm.
bro, I just the stigma in this community is so bad. And you would think with all that we do, we're making progress. And I feel like we're not making any progress in the last couple of years. It's just getting worse. Um, and I was talking to my friend Shar about it, about this community. I'm like, man, this community right now is in shambles. And I
Hmm.
hate saying it like that because I firmly believe like every message that I stand for, but it's so bad to a point where we're arguing about mental health. I just don't understand. Um,
Hmm.
so we kind of mentioned like the lack of like therapy and we lack the lack of resources that surround us and everything, right? Have you yourself experienced having a therapist or prescribed any mental health medication? Or is this just, or because I know you're what, you're 21, right?
Hmm.
Uh,
Yep.
so like I'm not sure if you've dove into looking into a therapist because I know when I was your age, I didn't really think about therapy first, but I guess yeah, I have that question for you.
Um, I never really went to a therapist. I know as a child, I went to counseling for a little while. Um, Probably only a couple days, and I didn't really enjoy it as much. I mean, I was really young when I was put in it. Um, but also my mental health was so bad as a kid that they wanted something to help me. So they put me on sertraline or Zoloft, and I've been on that for about 10 years now. Um, and I'm on like the max dose of it. And then about 4 years ago, I think it was, they put me on hydroxyzine, um, which is kind of an anxiety slash allergy medication that kind of just helps you not really like sleep. I mean, it helps me sleep and it helps me relax. That's kind of how the reason why they put me on it, because I would, be up all night because my brain would just be constantly racing, constantly keeping me up, and I just wasn't getting sleep. So about 4 years ago, they put me on that, and I feel like I've gotten a lot better sleep now with that. And I feel like medications for me have helped a lot more than that counseling ever did as a kid. I know the medications unfortunately don't work for everybody. It takes forever to find the right medication for you, but I was lucky to find the right medication to help me, get better. And I, still, go into, anxiety and depression, things like that, even with taking the medications.
Right.
It's not like a cure, but it's help.
And at the end of the day, that's really all that should matter is that it helps you,
Hmm.
right? And I feel like when it comes to, just, obviously not all doctors. I would hope that most doctors just kind of want to start with the solution before the medicine route, but like you said, medicine isn't for everybody, and
Right.
it's kind of like therapy. Therapy is not for everybody either. Um, I would just wonder if the people that do start on medication, especially like depression meds, if therapy would be a good way to like slowly move them off of there too. You know what I mean? Like I can definitely relate to the counseling when you were younger thing not helping because, like I said, 14 years old and counseling didn't do shit for me. And growing up, it took me what till I was 26, 27 before I actually started going into therapy. I mean, I think obviously waited too long, but um I think therapy for me is probably one of the best things that I could have done for myself. But I'm happy that medication helps you because again, I know therapy is not for everybody,
Hmm.
right? Um, so being in a relationship and you're engaged, right?
Yes, yep.
So being in a relationship and engaged with a son, what has been your biggest overall focus in terms of your significant other when it comes to like your mental well-being?
So you can, if I don't know if he could hear me or not, but he's like the best person that I've ever met. And um, he knows like I go through, anxiety, depression, things like that. He knows I have, you know, these mental disorders, things like that, that he's very understanding about them, and he knows kind of when I get like that. Um, Especially when we first started dating. I always like to tell people the story. So we started dating not long after we were started talking and after we met, and my anxiety just got the best of me. I ended up pretty much having a panic attack that I'm dating this guy that I just started talking to. I ended up breaking up with him after 3 hours. And so I explained to him what was going on. He was very understanding, which I'm so grateful for. That we talked for probably about a month after that and just kind of stayed friends and then got back together and have been together the last 6 years almost now. And now we have a son together and, you know, we live together. It all worked out in the end. And just, he's probably one of the most understanding people that I've ever met. And he really supports me in everything I do. I mean, he put off what he wants to do for me to go through college and things like that. And he wants me to succeed before he goes through what he wants to do. And um, I feel like he's someone that I really needed in my life to like show me like what a good, healthy relationship was. Because and I know my mom wouldn't care if I talked about this, but growing up, my parents like fought a lot. They did end up splitting up for a little while and then got back together. But that really put an effect on me and how I viewed relationships and how, you know, I grew up into like the person I am today. And, just communication and support and understanding is probably like the biggest traits, I guess, for someone, and he has like he's all of that to me and I'm just extremely grateful for him.
Yeah, and the biggest thing you said there was communication. I feel we're in that time period where there are so many people in this world and so many don't want to talk to each other. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
I feel when it comes to a relationship, you got to be open and honest about your feelings on everything. And I'm glad that he stuck around for those few months before you guys got back together. You guys talked about everything and him being understanding. And I feel we are missing so much understanding and communication in this world that it's I'm glad to see that in such like a young person like yourself because being 31 and having the people in my age group is a lot different than when I was growing up. People hate each other. Like it's at a point where it's really hard to communicate to people, especially when you're as talkative as a person as I am.
Hmm.
It's kind of like I kind of draw it similar to being in a room full of so many people, but nobody wants to talk to each other, kind of thing. And it's really happy to hear that there's somebody as young as yourself that is willing to break that mold of what relationships are supposed to be like, and not just giving up on the first flash of whatever inconvenience does happen in your relationship. So I'm happy for you. I'm happy everything that you're succeeding. I think the absolute world of you, and I think you're awesome.
Thank you. And I think the same with you. I mean, just this whole platform that you've created, is amazing. And I'm glad that my mom found it and then introduced me to it and just amazing seeing, in people in like other countries coming and joining, and it's just insane how much it's grown the last couple of years.
Yeah. Um, so I think we kind of browsed over it a little bit, but just to all my guests, I asked this and just want to hear your opinion on it too. If you could change one thing in the mental health community, what would it be?
Probably, like what we talked about, where people are so divided and it's just putting a major, you know, effect on the entire community. And I feel like everyone should be there for each other. Like we're all one big family going through similar things. We just want someone to listen to us and to hear us and what we're going through, and just mm, being so divided and just pretty much attacking each other isn't helping that any.
Yeah, I completely agree. I wish we there was more people to stand together instead of standing apart because
Mhm.
it shouldn't be an us versus them thing. It should be a us together kind of thing. Um,
Right.
so at the end of every podcast, I like to read some quotes that have to do with whatever we're covering. I know you had some song lyrics that you wanted to read to the listeners, and then I'll go ahead and read my quotes right after. So floor is yours.
So pretty much this is mostly because it's meaningful to me. This is something that a song that I listened to a lot growing up. And I know a lot of younger people actually know this band, and I talk about it all the time. 21 Pilots. That band has pretty much been my saving grace the entire of my childhood, and I still listen to them, and I even play their music for my son, even though he can't understand it yet. Um, but their one song from their album Vessels called Truce, and it's pretty much about you know people that are going through something, people that are suicidal, telling them it's okay, to live your life right now because life is beautiful, even though it doesn't seem it to you. Everyone will die at some point. In the lyrics, it says, "Now the night is coming to an end. The sun will rise and we will try again. Stay alive for me. You will die, but now your life is free. Take pride in what is sure to die." And that song has just always been so, meaningful to me. And those lyrics, just really hit your heartstrings and things like that.
I uh I like that a lot. You sent me a lot of 21 Pilot songs that I think every single one of them are incredible.
Hmm.
That's a powerful, very powerful song because we're at a beautiful part of music right now where people are finally starting to talk about mental health and going back to music that I grew up with. I didn't realize how many messages were in that music until growing up and understanding lyrics. So 21 Pilots for you is what Linkin Park was for me.
Hmm.
I think music is probably one of the greatest ways to express yourself and one of the greatest ways to get your creativity and get your passion and everything out of it. Music is just everything. So I'm really happy that 21 Pilots was there for you growing up because I think that's very important.
Hmm.
So I have two quotes, one for the prison mental health aspect, and then another for the youth. So the first one, it's more of a statistic opposed to a quote, but it's people with serious mental illnesses are 10 times more likely to be incarcerated in a state prison than receive treatment in a state hospital. And for those of you who have listened to this podcast, it's sad that we're at that point in our life where more people are getting locked up and instead of getting actual help. And I hope we can finally grow together as a community to get the help that people deserve and get more resources out there because it's sorely needed.
Hmm.
Um, Second one I have is from a Ross Green, and this is on children's mental health. Challenging behavior occurs when the demands and expectations being placed upon a child outstrip the skills they have to respond. I think as adults, we forget that children can't compute as much as we can. And I think there are way too many parents out there that expect so much from these kids. that don't realize that they're not talking to a fully developed adult. And
Mhm.
they grow up to be angry, they grow up to be depressed. And for me, with the kind of parents that I have, there was always some black cloud in my childhood because of how my parents were. And for any parents listening, um any time your kid is going through something, just make sure you listen to everything that they're going through. Don't respond right away. Not everything needs a response. Sometimes they just want somebody to listen to. Kid wants you to go and draw with them and not talk, or whatever. Do that with them. Do those activities with your kids. Experience life through the lens of a child with them while they're still young and while you still have them. Because in my opinion, being a parent is a privilege. It's not a job title, and it shouldn't be treated like a job title. Not everybody has the honor of being called mom or being called dad. So for those of you listening, enjoy all the years that you can with your kids before they're old enough to where you can't do it anymore. Um, until next time, guys, Reidyn, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I think it was great for both myself and all the listeners.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you and, getting being able to actually put this out there. It's really important to me and I know a lot of other people, so thank you for letting me come on here.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you guys for supporting the podcast as always. And for the Antisocial Network, thank you for hosting me on your network as well. Until next time, guys, be well. And as always,